My topic is not the dangers of climate change, which I take as given, but whether and how psychoanalytic thinking can contribute to debates about these questions. And the second thing I want to say as a preliminary is that I think, in my view, psychoanalytic thinking about political and social topics, indeed perhaps about all topics, is most interesting when it's unexpected and when it even is to some degree disturbing. And that's because the subject matter of psychoanalysis is unconscious states of mind that for different reasons people find it difficult to know about. And I think that's true in this context as well as in others. And I think what follows from that is that the unexpectedness of any psychoanalytic contribution to our thinking might be relevant to thinking about the way we ourselves think, that's to say people who are concerned about climate change, as well as to the thinking of those who we say deny and turn a blind eye to it. And that takes me on to my main topic, which is different structures of feeling towards the natural world. I think one can identify two distinct belief systems in regard to the relation of human beings to nature, which one can also think of in Raymond Williams' terms as structures of feeling, that's to say, organised complexes of thought and feeling which, shape our attitudes and behaviours. One such view focuses on modernisation, seeing this as a process which involved a deep and destructive transformation in the relations of humankind to nature. According to this, the worldview of modernity introduced deep splits in human relations to the world, substituting for an earlier relation of reciprocity a set of binary antagonisms, each of which constructed relationships of antagonism and domination. The separation of reason from emotion, of individuals from society, and the conception of nature as an object of conquest by human powers are aspects of these binaries. Marxism, as Raymond Williams reminded us in his early reflections on these questions, absorbed much of this way of thinking from bourgeois or capitalist forms of thought. A forceful and gloomy statement of this pessimistic perspective was given by the Frankfurt School theorist Max Horkheimer in his 1944 essay, The Concept of Enlightenment. An omnipotent idea of human reason has engulfed all other spheres of life, Horkheimer argued, expunging all scope for creativity and autonomy. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman's argument in his book Modernity and the Holocaust is also close to this conception, in its argument that the Holocaust, in its industrial extermination of a whole category of human beings, far from being an exceptional anomaly of modern societies, was the culmination of a transformative outlook in which the powers of reason, science and technology were deployed without moral limits in pursuit of whatever purposes those in control chose to adopt. Its legislators and interpreters contrasted an approach which saw mankind and its world as an appropriate subject for deliberate transformation in accordance with rational plans of various kinds, with one which would confine governmental and social intervention to one of interpretation and clarification of the different purposes of human actors. From a psychoanalytic perspective, one might ascribe to this modernist, transformative and conquering spirit a paranoid schizoid character, in Melanie Klein's terms. By the way, I hope you can see some affinities between the world outlook, the outlook cosmology that I've just described, and some of the positions that we've been talking about in relation to the environment and the climate. The paranoid schizoid position is characterised by its radical splitting between loved and hated objects, between an idealised inside and a denigrated outside, the good self or us and the bad other or them. Such splitting involves the projection of negative impulses outwards. Hostile enactments against the bad other often follow. Those engaged in these projections then, at some point, have to face the question of what has happened to the objects that are being damaged, in reality or fantasy or both. Can the damage be faced and reparation attempted, or will unconscious guilt be too great? Will retribution be feared, the return of the aggression that has been projected outwards? This situation can lead to a cycle of escalation of these projections, in which an enemy comes to be felt to be more dangerous as a consequence of the hostility directed towards it. Perpetrators can suffer psychological damage for the hatred they project outwards, as well as their victims, though this damage is less often recognised. Until the emergence to visibility of the ecological crisis in the 1960s and 1970s, we've perhaps been more aware of the construction of other human beings as the objects of antagonistic splitting, as its negative object, than of nature itself as this negative object. However, the representations of mechanical devastation in wars do sometimes bring the natural world into the picture as another victim of man's destructiveness. The romantic and socialist critiques, or some socialist critiques of capitalism, saw relations of slavery and industrial exploitation and its consequence. Most social critics were less interested in the aggressive implications of modernisation for nature itself. But there has been an aesthetic dimension to the critique of industrialism, for example, in the writings by William Morris or D.H. Lawrence, which Raymond Williams developed in his book Culture and Society. Paranoid schizoid states bring about the inhibition or destruction of mental function, since the discriminations which are necessary to thought are made impossible by the drive to categorise objects as wholly good or bad, and by the denial that they possess elements of both. A further development of this theoretical frame has drawn attention to the disavowals and denials of reality, the psychic retreats into narcissism or self-sufficiency, which can be responses to the pain of recognition of the claims of and need for loved objects. Moving out of the paranoid schizoid into more depressive ways of thinking can be found too painful to endure if there are no internalised good objects to sustain a belief in the existence of good objects outside the self. Not seeing and not noticing is a widespread response to a psychic situation in which objects are felt to have been damaged and where little hope exists that reparation can take place. There is, however, a contrasting historical narrative of the human relation to nature, which was explored in Keith Thomas's book, Man and the Natural World, Changing Attitudes in England from 1500 to 1800, and which is also implicit in Norbert Elias's thesis on what he called the civilizing process. Keith Thomas describes the emergence in the early modern period, from 1500, of attitudes which began to question an earlier conception of nature, which had been wholly anthropocentric and exploitative, and not the state of benign harmony and reciprocity, sometimes imagined by later critics of industrialism. Christianity had claimed the authority of God for subordinating all other species to the service of human needs. Early science retained these Christian assumptions. Quote, "For Bacon, the purpose of science was to restore to man that dominion over the creation which he had partly lost at the fall," while Robert Boyle was egged on by his correspondent, John Beale, to establish what Beale called the empire of mankind. To scientists reared in this tradition, the whole purpose of studying the natural world was, quote, "that nature, being known, may be mastered, managed, and used in the service of human life." Descartes argued that animals were mere machines or automata like clocks, capable of complex behaviour, but wholly incapable of speech, reasoning, or in some interpretations, even sensation, unquote. Although for Descartes the human body was also an automaton, the difference was that within the human machine there was a mind and therefore a separate soul, whereas brutes were automatons without minds or souls. Only man combined both matter and intellect. Thomas was here describing the foundations of exactly the worldview which is now challenged and rejected as the mentality which threatens to destroy the entire planet. But while Thomas described the founding elements of this cosmology, his primary purpose was to show that even as it was being elaborated, it was also being challenged and modified. Rather than attitudes to nature, to other species, and to members of other human communities becoming more exploitative and indifferent during the early modern period, Thomas argued that other ways of thinking were beginning to develop and be heard at this time. As he says, quote, "Moralists urged that the beast should be treated with kindness and consideration. Aesthetes saw the earth as an object of beauty and contemplation, rather than as a mere resource to be plundered. By 1800, there had been generated feelings which would make it increasingly hard for men to accept the uncompromising methods by which the dominance of their species had been formally secured." Thomas describes the changing language of natural history, the greater responsibility taken by farmers for the well-being of their animals, the growth of the keeping of pets, the spread of tree planting and flower cultivation, the origins of vegetarianism, and admiration for the wilderness as aspects of this change in sensibility. In the following century came Darwin and his definitive challenge to the idea of man's created difference from and superiority to other species. The Origin of Species memorably concluded, "From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." More inclusive and respectful conceptions of human relations were advanced, critical of slavery, the subjection of women, indifference to children, and leading to modern conceptions of universal and inclusive human rights. Norbert Elias's account of this process was of the gradual inhibition of brutish and selfish human instinctual impulses and their regulation and sublimation in more sociable directions. Elias, in effect, interpreted Freud's Civilization and its Discontents as a historical narrative of the actual development of civility and restraint. Psychoanalytically, one can think of this more responsible conception of the relations between man and the natural world in the Kleinian framework of the depressive position, in contrast to the paranoid schizoid orientation of the conquest of nature and the imposition of civilization on the realms of the primitive, quote-unquote, including nature and the wilderness itself. The depressive position in this psychoanalytic perspective is understood as enabling loved and hated attributes to be recognized as sometimes belonging to the same object. The capacity to integrate rather than split conflicting feelings is the precondition for rational discrimination and thought. It's taken in the Kleinian theory of infant development as an aspect of maturation. How do we choose between these contrasting historical narratives, noting as we may the different states of mind or psychological configurations to which they seem to give an external shape? The reality is that each of them embodies a substantial element of the truth, each describing a major aspect of this history. The different tendencies represented in these narratives remain in constant contention in our own contemporary society. The concerns about nature that we've been discussing at this conference are also part of this picture, as well as the destructive energies expended on subordinating it. It's possible to map the ongoing debates about the environment through these psychological categories, where environmental destruction is proceeding apace, with massive investments continuing in carbon-producing and carbon-burning technologies, and little effort being made to change the prevailing patterns of energy use and consumption. One can readily see evidence of pathological denials of reality, or even, as some believe, an unconscious destructive wish actively to deny the resources of the planet to future generations. A recent article by Naomi Klein on the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, which I expect some of you saw, set out such a psychopolitical critique in vivid terms. She pictured the inside of the world being penetrated and pillaged as millions of gallons of oil spilled out of the seabed. There was a feminist overtone to this description, drilling for oil being made to seem like a particularly brutal rape of Mother Nature. One does not need to look far to find justified objects of such criticisms. For example, Sarah Palin's drill, baby, drill approach to the problems of American energy supply. And for an argument which showed these conflicting perspectives in fierce opposition, there was a debate in Charleston, Virginia, between a United States coal baron, one Don Blankenship, and Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., on the issue of mountaintop removal mining, which blows the tops off mountains to get at thin seams of coal, and of which Blankenship is the most notorious promoter. Kennedy described this mining as, quote, the worst environmental crime that has ever happened in our history. It is a crime, it is a sin, it is our moral obligation to stop this from happening, he said. Kennedy attacked Blankenship's company for its anti-unionism, its destruction of jobs, and for its breaches of the law. Blankenship replied, quote, that it's a bunch of rhetoric and untruths. This industry is what has made this country great. If we forget that, we're going to have to learn to speak Chinese or expect early deaths, noting that life expectancy in Angola is 39 years. Blankenship is a climate change denier, quote, global warming is a hoax. Anyone who says they know what the temperature of the Earth is going to be in 2020 or 2030 needs to be put in an asylum because they don't. The irrationalities of Blankenship's position are scarcely obscure. Quote, coal is what made the Industrial Revolution possible, he said. If windmills were the thing to do, if solar panels were, it would happen naturally, he said. But excess is not only on one side. Quote, companies such as Blankenships are exploding the explosive equivalent of Hiroshima every week, Kennedy said. Even though one might think that the horror of Hiroshima was not so much its scale of explosive energy, but its object. The destruction of a mountain should not be equated with that of a city. We should not consider that our own life form has no special significance for us, care as we should about others. It wouldn't be difficult to reproduce many instances of this kind of denialist argument, and also of morally outraged responses to them, like Robert Kennedy Jr.'s. One can easily position those expressing most concern about the environmental future as having the most enlightened and mature psychological orientation, while those in apparent denial of such concerns as possessed by the most pathological states of mind. This antithesis is reminiscent of one which was developed by psychoanalysts such as Hannah Siegel, who, as Dave Bell reminded us earlier, wrote and mobilised against the dangers of nuclear war in the 1980s. Much of what was said about the unconscious destructiveness and denial implicit in the advocates of the nuclear deterrent was insightful. Siegel's argument that the Western political system was so addicted to paranoid schizoid antagonisms that the loss, indeed defeat, of one enemy would lead to its rapidly locating another, radical Islam and the war on terror, has proved highly prescient, demonstrating the depth of her original psychoanalytical insight. Nevertheless, Bob Hinshelwood made a telling observation when he pointed out that the peace movement may have served unwittingly to uphold the stability of this system, even while aiming to disrupt it, in providing a visible container for peaceful, i.e. depressive sentiments, which were, however, located in such a marginal position in relation to the dominant structure that they had little real influence on events. Is there a risk that right-thinking green movements might find themselves occupying a parallel position in relation to the environmental debates? Neither of the two accounts of modernity outlined above and the contending psychological dispositions which have informed them will suffice in isolation from the other, any more than either paranoid schizoid or depressive states can be wholly banished from the psyches of functioning human beings. The reality is that unconscious fantasy enters into the imaginative constructions both of the industrial or paranoid schizoid mentality that seeks to subordinate nature to the rational will, and of the conservationist or depressive states of mind which identifies with nature against human exploitation and cruelty. Denials of complex realities are to be found on both sides of this divide. The less obvious risk, which is on the environmentalist side of the argument, is that of merely turning on its head the modernist split between man and nature, where the modernist orientation holds humankind as the bearer of all value, while nature is defined as its mere instrument. The latter is at risk of ascribing all value to nature and little to humankind. This can be implied by an account of modernisation as a narrative of destructiveness, which denies the broad improvements in the conditions of human life which have taken place and are indeed still taking place. Arguments in favour of the continued advance of the global economic system extrapolate this progressive historical story to newly developing parts of the world. They endorse arguments made on behalf of the populations of China or India or Brazil or Africa that they are entitled to seek to realise the same reduced levels of infant mortality, extended life expectancy, and access to education as those in the West, whatever else needs to be said and done about sustainable modes of production and consumption. On the other side of this dualistic argument, there are also difficulties with the ideas concerning nature which are advanced by conservationists when they appear to oppose economic development. In reality, nearly all of what we conceive as the natural world in developed societies is already a hybrid entity created through the interactions of human activity and nature, and has been for hundreds of years. The Highlands of Scotland have their incredibly beautiful scenery because their trees were once deliberately destroyed, and because patterns of animal husbandry have not permitted them to regenerate naturally. The habitats of downlands, fenlands, broadlands and brecklands in southern and eastern England seem to need nearly as much careful management to sustain them in their desired natural condition as the growing of arable crops. Although there are large expanses of the globe, some rainforests and the great oceans, for example, which are still little affected by human activities, and which need to remain so, there are many others whose state can no longer be described as pristine or natural. In fact, the terms nature and natural are frequently deployed to defend landscapes which are in fact the inheritance of one epoch of human intervention against more modern interventions which are now perceived to threaten them. I saw a television program the other day about the prairies in America in 1492, which informed me, which I was stunned by, that the reason why there were so many thousands and thousands of bison being hunted by Native Americans was because they burnt the prairie grass every year in order to create larger meadows, as it were, for these animals. So what I had thought was a completely natural state turns out to have been a kind of early kind of cultivation or husbandry. A way of thinking about these issues, which tries to avoid the antithesis set up by the advocates and opponents of modernity, has been developed by Bruno Latour in the movement of the sociology of science called actor-network theory. Latour is a French sociologist of science. He calls into question the distinction between the very categories of nature and culture. He argues that the very idea of nature as a sphere separate from humanity and human agency was always an ideological one, framed to uphold a certain kind of dissociated rationalism. But this split, he says, between the natural and the human scarcely exists in reality. We have never been modern, one of his books proclaims. This is because mankind has always necessarily been a part of nature, not separate from it. And since the nature we experience has been continually reconceived and reshaped through human agency. The world that we see and interact with is full of what he calls hybrid entities, such as atoms, electrons, gravitational forces, bacteria, viruses, and genes, and one could add unconscious minds, which only ever become visible or available as entities that we can influence or manipulate as a consequence of actions by scientists within and upon nature. This conception of humankind as an integral element in a larger system, within which it has evolved with certain powers of understanding and reflection, is valuable. It may help us to resolve some misleading misconceptions in the environmental debate. Latour's contention is that man lives in a continuing interaction with the rest of nature and needs to accept its responsibility within the whole system of which it is a part. He has even argued for a system of governance in which elements of nature, such as rivers or forests, would be given advocates or voices of their own in a kind of multi-agent entity parliament. This is not because Latour ascribes some mystical authority to the sphere of the natural or to nature, but because there are many elements of this interdependent human-natural system that social actors, human actors, in their hubristic pride, are liable to discount or overlook, even though they retain great causal potency and significance in human affairs. The phenomena of climate change are a pressing instance of these effects of systematic interdependence. Of course, one could say that environmentalist movements and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, with its 1 million members, represent voices in a kind of quasi-virtual parliament of the political governance system, since they are indeed effective advocates for species other than human beings. The idea that human societies exist within much larger networks and systems, in which they exercise only limited powers, often without knowledge of many of the effects of human actions, seems a salutary way of asserting the salience of the reality principle against different kinds of denial of complexity and interdependency.
Knowing Michael's work and knowing him a bit from the past, I was kind of expecting to agree with him more than I in fact do. So there are some significant differences. And I should also perhaps start by positioning myself as someone who's sympathetic but actually a moderate skeptic of psychoanalytic modes of understanding. And I can probably make it a bit clearer where the scepticism lies in my further responses to Michael's paper. And the first point I want to make is a sort of epistemological one. I don't want to make too much of it because it's familiar to you all. But I think it needs to be said because it's politically potentially quite significant. And that is that I think there are two discursive modes in Michael's paper. The way he deals with the narratives of modernisation as domination, and then the inversion of that, the kind of nature-endorsing environmentalism, are treated by him as discursive expressions of underlying psychological dynamics, as a vague kind of sense that there's something pathological about them. And I'll just refer to that way of dealing with the cognitive frameworks of people one disagrees with as the diagnostic mode. But then when Michael speaks in his own voice of the complexity and interdependence of the kinds of processes and objects that are counterposed in those other frameworks, when he speaks in his own voice, we are, I think, invited to read his discourse as truth-seeking, as cognitive, and as he says at one point, as objective, to which we might respond in a different mode, the critical as distinct from a diagnostic mode. That's to say, to look at the evidence behind what he says and to examine it for consistency and so on. And I'll pay Michael the respect of treating him in the critical rather than the diagnostic mode. And the first thing I want to say is that I agree with the broad metaphysics that he develops as an alternative to the two positions that he rejects, and or at least that he thinks of as too kind of one-sided. That's to say, the view of the complexity of the world, the interdependence of human practices and the different layers of the naturally given conditions and naturally transformed conditions and so on within which we live. That kind of complexity and interdependence is a kind of metaphysical picture that broadly I share and indeed have been working on for about the last 30 years in conjunction with quite a network of other scholars and activists such as Kate Soper and Peter Dickens in this country and Joel Covell, Jim O'Connor and others in the States and elsewhere. Now, whilst I sort of broadly agree with that general metaphysical conception, it seems to me that Latour's work is actually not a very good way of getting to it, and I would really compliment Michael in the way he's produced something very constructive out of Latour's rather whimsical and I think somewhat inadequate and self-contradictory way of kind of addressing these questions. So I think he makes something better of Latour than Latour does, and so that's nice to hear. But beyond the metaphysics, I would want to question the more substantive explanatory framework that he adopts, and that is this centrality of climate change and the fossil fuel dependency of the current phase of historical industrialism. Now, I would want to argue, and I haven't got time to do it here, but we might in discussion later, I'd want to argue that climate change is merely one symptom amongst a number of others of a much deeper and much broader crisis in the relationship between globalizing capitalism and our naturally given conditions of existence. And there's a real danger in singling out climate change as if it were the problem and thinking that a technological shift to a different energy base would provide us with solutions. And among the dangers of that are, firstly, that many of the strategies that are likely to be adopted if we don't consider climate change in relation to other dimensions of this crisis will make it much worse. And I just give you the examples without being able to develop it further of biofuels in relation to biodiversity and food production. And I mention the option of nuclear power on a global scale as another kind of risk that we face. And so I think just to address climate change and to address it in isolation from these other profound problems, such as world hunger, the changes in access to and availability of fresh water, and of biodiversity destruction, which have their independent drivers, although interconnected with one another and interconnected with CO2 emissions. That's profoundly dangerous. The second problem that I find with Michael's analysis is that we can't even, I think, address the problem of CO2 and climate change and do it democratically without evoking the kinds of negative psychological, social, pathological responses that we've already seen, actually, in some specific attempts to kind of restrict everyday behaviour in relation to climate change. We can't do that. We can't do it democratically without simultaneous subjective and cultural shifts in the way we experience, value, and engage with one another and with the non-human world. And I don't think those changes at the level of subjectivity and culture and experience, I don't think they can be produced or sustained independently of a kind of challenge to the dominating political and economic structures that shape our world. And that means, I think, that we can't do without, as a frame of analysis, the sort of deeper challenges to our current mode of life, represented by the cultural and normative and aesthetic critique that comes from the deeper end of green politics, and without the anti-capitalist analysis that some of us have been developing. I think unless we can actually understand these processes as connected with the dynamics, the dynamics of global capital accumulation, we won't begin to address the question. So what follows from that kind of line of argument, which is clearly very different from the notion of a minimalist kind of consensus around dealing with CO2 emissions that Michael advocates. Well, amongst the problems that remain are how can we extend the political imagination to think through what a post-capitalist institutional form which could sustain and nurture this transformed structure of sentiments in relation to nature and to each other? How can we imagine that? And particularly, how can we imagine it in the face of the disasters that have happened in the previous century in relation to other radical projects of transformation? And the second sort of question, which, I don't know, psychoanalysts, I guess, have got something to say about, but I'm not entirely convinced always with the things they say, is that are there deep obstacles in human nature itself to the kind of restructuring of our sentiments and our feelings for one another and for nature that would be required by a long-term, sustainable society in which we could achieve such happiness as humans are capable of, and one in which we behaved in ways that were much more appreciative, respectful, and nurturing, both of one another and of the natural world. And I want to say that a more kind of optimistic vision than the one you get, say, from the later Freud in Civilization and Its Discontents, which I was going to quote but haven't really got time, would be the vision of alternative hedonism that's being developed by one of the people that I mentioned before as part of this growing international dialogue, the work of Kate Soper and her concept of alternative hedonism. Finding within the interstices of our existing society and recognizing and reminding ourselves of the sources of satisfaction and happiness and pleasure that we have that bypass the commodity system. Although, of course, I want to emphasize in relation particularly to poverty in this country and poverty in other parts of the world, those sources of pleasure require the security of access to the most basic material resources that our organic being actually requires for itself.
I come from the advertising world. I worked in it I sort of fell out of university into it about sort of 8 years ago and trundled along, hating myself to a larger and larger extent until earlier this year when I left. Principally because I was investigating these sorts of issues more and more, and one of my favourite thinkers on this is Tim Jackson of the SDC, who described consumerism as, and we get this right, a system where people spend money they don't have. People are encouraged to spend money they don't have on things they don't need to make an impression that won't last on people they don't care about. When you work in advertising, believe me, that cuts. So most of the practitioners in this room, quite frankly, would have quite a field day with me and most of my ex-colleagues. But what I do come with, on a slightly more serious note, I've stepped out of advertising because I wanted to. I believe the skills that industry has are extremely powerful, and a lot of them are rooted in the sort of theories of psychoanalysis. Eddie Bernays, who's the sort of American who basically invented advertising and PR, was Freud's nephew, which is a slightly scary point, and I'm sure most of you are aware of that. But I wanted to step out to start to think about what is the thing that I think needs to be sold, if that's the right word, which I don't think it quite is. But and I'm really grateful to Michael and to the guys for giving me the opportunity to respond to this paper, because and I agree with Ted in this, because I actually think the central thought, this idea of we are part of nature, is far more significant than Michael even allows. To me, that could well be the thing, that sort of new story of humanity as part of nature rather than separate from, could well be the fundamental thing that we need to, again, sell is not quite the right word, but go with it for now. And I want to briefly just lay out a couple of examples of things that are going on in the world already that sort of show the potential of that. And if you work, rather than looking at the specifics of what's going on, if you try and think about what the worldview underneath that leads to different innovations is, I think you can really see the power of this. So just to contrast two things, there's a new report the RSPB have just published called In the Red, which is about who's going to pay for the biodiversity crisis. And it's interesting because it sort of brings out both the conservationist and the industrialist view in one and the same place, because they start off by saying, characterising nature as this pure object to be protected. And their aim is laid out as being to sort of save at least some places from the impact of man, which is, as Michael sort of points out, isn't necessarily the best way to think about these things. Then they move sort of almost seamlessly into characterising nature as a resource, and they latch onto various market mechanisms to try and solve this problem. The sort of foremost of them being conservation credits and the creation of ecosystem markets, which I think we've seen a lot of rhetoric from Caroline Spellman, the Secretary of State for Environment, that she's pretty keen on this idea. But the problem is that because this works from the worldview of man as separate from nature, it fails to recognise that, among other things, it fails to recognise that nature is everywhere and must function healthily everywhere to function healthily at all. It's this, and here the little bit of one of my favourite thinkers, Thomas Berry, that I want to add in. He said famously that the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And I think when you embrace that communion, you understand that you can't just separate these things out and solve one problem at a time, which is kind of what Ted's getting at, I think. Now contrast that with something one of the nascent movements around the world that I think is rooted, a political approach that is rooted in the conception of man as part of nature. Growing from Latin America outward at the moment, there's a real movement to ascribe rights to nature, and this really plays directly from the idea of Latour that Michael talked about, of representation. And it's championed by a South African lawyer called Cormac Cullinan, who's written a book called Wild Law, which I can highly recommend. For example, under the Ecuadorian constitution, any citizen can bring a lawsuit on behalf of Pachamama, the Mother Earth, for damage done to her. And that might seem a little way off for us, but just a little closer to home in Hungary, they have the first parliamentary commissioner for future generations, So there is representation in Hungary for future generations, which is really interesting. I mean, it's clearly not done a whole lot of good in the Danube recently, but we'll leave that aside for now. So just to sort of set out where you might go that's a bit different if you're working from this worldview of man as part of nature politically. Second thing I wanted to do is just touch on energy, which Ted sort of talked about as well, and the Sahara solar installation that Michael talked about. Now, I'm not going to say that wouldn't be a good thing to do. In some ways, I haven't engaged fully enough with all the things involved. But as Ted says, what will this do to our impact on the simultaneous crises of biodiversity, ocean acidification, water shortage, food shortage, population growth, etc.? This isn't a one-stop solution. And there's some really interesting work that I would celebrate more highly and sort of put a bit more of a flame under, which is sort of rising in various places around the world. And some of the sort of lead thinkers are people like Bill McDonough in the States and Michael Braungart, whose book Cradle to Cradle is again a really powerful read. And Gunter Pauli and his growing band of disciples from Devon to Namibia. They work by looking at nature and design their activity on the models of nature. And I think what they're looking to do is try and work with the grain rather than against the grain. It's quite powerful stuff. So just to give one example to sort of make sense of it, they work on the first principle that in nature all waste from one system is the raw material for the next system. So Gunter Pauli in Namibia has designed a zero-impact brewery, so one good outcome already. But that brewery complex also hosts a mushroom farm, a bakery, and a water purification plant. And all the processes on that one place also generate their own power. And that's a really different way of coming at this whole thing, where you're trying to use what's there, you're trying to find ways to bring it all together. So the first point I want to make is when you embrace that, when you fully embrace that idea of the new world, this sort of different story of ourselves, you get to some really exciting places. You start thinking about how we can generate energy from waste and partner that with efforts to raise energy consciousness all at localised levels, instead of just accepting that energy needs are going to rise and rise and rise and seeking an alternative mass source to satisfy them. You start looking at localising supply chains, building resilience and quality of life in doing so, instead of accepting the status quo and seeking just incrementally to reduce the carbon intensity of air travel, say. So point number one, I think it's a more significant thought than we've given credit to it. The question that raises for me then is if I think that's the thing we need to sell, how do you sell it? And I've been thinking about this for a while, and I'd like to say I've got further than I have now. I think the first thing I'd say is back to that statistic that I gave you at the beginning of my little spiel. It's almost impossible for a shift in stories to happen when the current dominant story is quite so choking. I think there's something about sort of the oxygen for this new story to breathe, which is so restricted at the moment. And one of the pieces of work I'm doing at the moment, I'm working with Tom Crompton, his name's already been dropped once or twice, and who I've texted to make sure he's very nervous about appearing tomorrow. But Tom and I are working on a critique of the advertising industry, which looks at ideas of how much is the advertising industry part of forcing this narrative of separation, forcing this narrative of consumption, and what Tim Jackson critiques as consumerism onto people, to the sort of exclusion of all other possible stories. And just to sort of give you the fundamental question that we're looking at is, what are we doing to society when when the average person sees 1,600 ads a day that all have the underlying message, you are a consumer, and that is your role in society? I think that's a really fundamental question, actually. The other aspect of it, it's not just consumerism. I think there's something about our work culture as well, particularly in this country. And Madeline Bunting's book of a few years ago called Willing Slaves, I'd recommend. And she talks about how 36% of the population are too tired at the end of the day to do anything other than slump on the sofa. So again, you're sort of choking out that oxygen.
Yep.
So But I think there are also positive steps. Sorry, just on that, I'd also touch on some really interesting work being done by people like Pat Kane on the concept of the play ethic and the more playful society, which I think is very interesting. If a healthy society needs to work, rest and play, where's play gone for us? Just to wind up,
Okay.
I'm being eyebrowed. Just to wind up, the last thing I want to talk about, I do think there is a positive thing we can do, which is to get people out into nature to reform that fundamental connection, because that at least makes the soil more fertile for that new story to take hold. And I think that there's a shocking study recently saying that 64% of 8 to 12-year-olds play outside less than once a week. Most of the work I'm doing at the National Trust at the moment is focused on how do we get people out into nature, how do we allow that story to emerge.